Well, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for streaming, joining us on the stream today. For those of you I don't know, as Chris said, my name's Tim. I'm a dad of three, actually soon to be 4 children. I work in financial modelling up in London, well, usually in our spare room currently, and I'm part of the team here at the Beacon Church. And I want to start this morning by letting you in to a secret. I've been a Christian for most of my life. As some of you will have seen, I've taught here at the Beacon Church many times. I've been on Christian leadership courses. I've written essays. I've written articles. I've read a lot about Christianity. And yet, I still have some doubts. I have doubts about Christianity when I meet wonderful and kind and intelligent people who have reached a different conclusion to me. I have doubts when we pray, when we beg God to save the life of a friend, but are met seemingly with silence. I have doubts when I see men who claim to follow Jesus doing things that come from the pit of hell. Now, please don't mishear me. I'm a follower of Jesus. I am persuaded that the Christian story makes by far the most sense of the world we see around us. For example, I'm persuaded about Christianity when I first held my newborn son. I just could not conceive that he was only the product of an accident, that whether I loved him or whether I hated him, that the universe was ultimately indifferent because in a few million years' time it wouldn't matter. I'm persuaded because I believe that I have met Jesus personally, and his life and his death and his resurrection have transformed my life, but I do still have doubts, and I don't think I'm the only one. Whether or not you follow Jesus, I think many of us can have that experience when we're going through life and we're wondering, have we backed the right horse? Are we doing the right things, or are we just kind of aimlessly drifting through? I think we have doubts about what will happen to us when we die, what the future holds for us then. And today we're going to be looking at how we can process those doubts. In today's story, we meet John the Baptist. John was one of the first people to follow Jesus. He was actually born a few years before him, and John had spent most of his life telling people that a Messiah was coming. Someone sent from God was on the way. And then when he met Jesus, he nailed his colors to the mast straight away. He said, "This is the man of whom I have been speaking. This is the man sent from God." And the authorities already thought John was crazy enough. He lived out in the wilderness and he dressed weirdly and he ate funny food. But at this point, they now disliked him even more. They ignored him. They thought he was crazy. But John had placed his faith in Jesus. Fast forward a little while and we'll get to this passage that I'm about to read to you from Matthew's account of Jesus' life. And as you will see, we'll find that John is in prison and he seems now to have some doubts. Let's read together from Matthew 11. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." As John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear fine clothes are in the king's palaces. Then what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes. I tell you, and more than a prophet, this is the one about whom it is written, 'I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' Truly I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist, yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." As we've just seen, John now has some doubts about Jesus. This man who once said, "Behold, here's the Lamb of God who's come to take away the sins of the world. This is the man who God has sent," is now saying, "Are you the one who was to come?" And we don't know for sure what's happening in his mind, but we do know that in prison, John would have been isolated. He would have been suffering. He would have been feeling very distant from Jesus. Whilst at the same time, the world around him doesn't seem to have changed. The Romans, the evil power that he thought was going to be overthrown by Jesus, and the reason ultimately that he's in prison, well, they're still ruling, and he's still in prison. And I can imagine him lying in his cell, puzzling these things through. You know, why hasn't Jesus set me free? If he's doing all of these miracles, why not for me? Have I backed the wrong horse? You know, I've bet my whole life on Jesus. Was that a mistake? And I've not spent time in a prison cell before, but for me at least, these questions aren't entirely unfamiliar. And I wonder if there are times when you become uncertain of things of which you were previously so sure. Times in your life where you wonder, am I missing what matters the most? Times when you might see or experience pain or injustice or even sickness or death with friends or with family. And you wonder, where is this God, and is he really good? Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe you don't believe in a God, but you have some of those moments that I described earlier, maybe when you're first holding your child, or when you're climbing a mountain and you look out on the horizon, or you stare into deeper space and you think, is it really possible that this is all just the product of random chance, and that there's no ultimate significance in anything that I do, because it just doesn't really feel like that? Well, whoever we are and whatever our doubts are, how do we process them? And is it even possible to answer these questions in a rational way? Well, the Christian answer is yes. And in this passage, we're going to see three things that Jesus does in response to John's doubt that might help us know how to process our own. But before we get into those, why don't we just take a moment to prepare ourselves to hear from Jesus, and hand back to Tim and the band to lead us in one more song.
Let it be Jesus, the first name that I call. Let it be Jesus, my song inside the storm. I'll never need another. For me to live is Christ. For me to live is Christ. God, I breathe your name above everything. Let it be Jesus. Let it be Jesus. From the rising of the sun, let it be Jesus. When all is said and done, I'll never need another. Jesus, there's no other. For me to live is Christ. For me to live is Christ. God, I breathe your name above everything. Let it be Jesus. Should I ever be abandoned? Should I ever be acclaimed? Should I ever be surrounded by the fire and the flame? There's a name I will remember. There's a name I will proclaim. Let it be Jesus. And should I ever be surrounded? Should I ever be acclaimed? Should I ever be surrounded by the fire
Thanks, Tim. So we've just sung this song, remembering Jesus, committing ourselves to him. So why don't we now listen to what he has to say in the face of our doubts? We see three things in this passage. The first is this: Jesus' response to John's doubt was not frustration or anger. He's not cross that John had some doubts. He's not sitting there on his pedestal thinking, why can't you just get it all together? He's not concerned. He's not threatened by them. And so I think, like John, we can have confidence that we can process our doubts. We can do it with each other. We can do it by reading the Bible. We can do it in prayer with Jesus. We can ask questions, and that's okay. In Mark's account of Jesus' life, he tells us of another time when a father whose son was born blind came to Jesus, but he also had doubts. He said, if you can do anything, have compassion on us. And Jesus responds, he says, if you can, well, all things are possible for those who believe. And then this man in the same breath says, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. He says, Lord Jesus, I trust you, but I need your help to overcome some of the doubts that I have. Jesus wasn't cross with him either. His son is healed. Now, Jesus can handle our doubts, so we can bring them to him with confidence. The second thing that we see in Jesus' response to John, and this is where we'll spend most of our time, is that he points him to the evidence. His disciples ask, are you the one who is to come? And Jesus says, go back and report to John what you hear and what you see. In other words, come and see the evidence. So when we're wrestling with our doubts, I think we can be confident again that Jesus won't just say to us, all you need is a little bit of blind faith. You just need to close your eyes and hope that you got it right. He says the opposite. He says, open your eyes, come and see. Come and evaluate the evidence for yourself. And that's what I want to do for the next 10 minutes or so this morning. Because maybe you're investigating Christianity for the first time and you've never looked at the evidence for Jesus. Or maybe you've been following him for a while, but you still have doubts about parts of what you've been taught. Maybe you just want to be better prepared to give a defense for what you believe, or prepared in case you face difficult times ahead. Well, whatever situation you're in, I'm hoping that looking at the evidence for the claim of Jesus will help you today. At the heart of the Christian faith, we find not a book, not an experience, but a man, a real historical man who lived and died amongst us. And when we doubt, when we wonder if it's worth it all, when we suffer, we can look again at his life, at his death, and in particularly at his resurrection. Because it's on his resurrection that everything else hangs. The early Christian leader Paul wrote to a church in Corinth, and he says, if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is futile. But if Jesus has been raised, then surely everything else that he says matters too. The American pastor Tim Keller summarizes it like this. He says, if Jesus rose from the dead, then surely we have to accept all that he said. If he didn't rise from the dead, then why worry about anything that he said? The issue on which everything hangs is not on whether you like his teaching, but whether he rose from the dead. But how can we know? How can we assess this extraordinary claim in the midst of our doubt? Because, of course, there are some people who say that we can't. The God Delusion author Richard Dawkins puts it like this. He says, presumably what happened to Jesus is what happens to all of us when we die. We decompose. Accounts of Jesus' resurrection and ascension are about as well documented as Jack and the Beanstalk. The Christian answer, though, is that we can look at the evidence. And that there's evidence that we find both in the accounts that eventually ended up in the Bible, but also outside of those accounts. And it's not the evidence you might find in a science lab. We don't prove that Shakespeare wrote plays or that Caesar crossed the Rubicon by looking at test tubes. But the way we do history is we look for evidence that we have, for manuscript, for eyewitness accounts, and look for the story or the explanation that best explains that evidence. So with Shakespeare, it might be plays with his name on it and verifying eyewitness accounts. Those things don't prove beyond a doubt that Shakespeare was real and wrote plays. There might have been an elaborate hoax that we don't understand, but that's not the natural or the rational conclusion to reach. And so we can apply the same process to the resurrection. Let's have a look at the evidence. Let's not assume anything in the Bible is definitely true just because it's there, but let's evaluate it like we would any other historical evidence, and let's see what explanation best fits it. So first, 3 bits of evidence. The first thing that we know is that very soon after Jesus' death, some of his followers believed and claimed that he had risen from the dead. And we have lots of manuscripts, both in and out of the Bible, that say that this was the case. And one of them's dated to just within a couple of years of Jesus' life. And if you think about it, it's very, very unlikely that Christianity would have even started unless there was at least some people claiming that this was true. The author Bart Ehrman, who's a skeptic, his books include things like revealing the hidden contradictions in the Bible, just to be really clear what side he's on. He writes this. He says, there can be no doubt historically that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he was raised from the dead. No doubt whatsoever. First bit of evidence. They might have been wrong, but that's what they claimed. The second piece of evidence we have is that Jesus' tomb was empty. How do we know this? Well, again, we have multiple different historical sources written by different people in different places at different times, all who said that this is what happened. The second thing we know, though, is that these writings are very unlikely just to be Christian propaganda putting forward a myth. And the reason we know that is that the first witnesses to the empty tomb were women. And in the first century, a woman's word was seen so unreliable that they weren't even allowed to give testimony in court. So if you were an early Christian and you were trying to convince people of something that you knew wasn't true, there is absolutely no reason you would have whatsoever to make a woman the first witness of the empty tomb. Unless, of course, you were trying to tell the story as it happened. And the third thing we know is that even the religious leaders who opposed Jesus acknowledged the empty tomb. We know this because one of the early source documents told us that in response to the empty tomb, they told people to tell people his disciples had stolen him. They acknowledged that there was no body. And think about it. If you were a religious leader, you just had your way, Jesus had just been executed, and then this nasty rumor started coming up that maybe actually he'd risen from the dead. If you knew that there was a body in the tomb, surely what you would do is roll away the stone and let people see for themselves. Unless, of course, there was no body there. The scholar Geza Vermes, who taught at Oxford, Durham, Edinburgh universities, another man who's not a Christian, he said this: when every argument has been considered, the only conclusion acceptable to the historian must be one disconcerting fact, namely that the women who set out to pay their last respects to Jesus found, to their consternation, not a body, but an empty tomb. The third and final piece of evidence I want to look at this morning is this. Many people had experiences of a risen Jesus. They believed that they had seen him. And again, we have multiple sources from different people saying that this has happened to them. And crucially, these weren't just people who were on Team Jesus before he died. One of them was Jesus' brother, who'd previously said that he was out of his mind. He said that he'd seen the risen Jesus, and he ended up giving his life for him. Another was a man named Saul, who'd previously traveled killing Christians. He too had a vision of the risen Jesus and gave his life as well. But it's not just the written evidence that shows us that this is true. We also know that something must have happened to the followers of Jesus to transform them from a ragtag group of scared men and women into a movement that would change the world. And just imagine for a moment that you are one of those followers and you'd followed Jesus and then you'd seen him executed, and a couple of days later you went to the empty tomb and you saw that there was nobody there. What is the natural conclusion that you would reach? maybe this will help. Imagine you go to visit a friend in prison. You know that it is impossible for them to leave their cell on their own, but you arrive and the cell is empty all the same. Do you think that, maybe they have escaped, or do you turn to the guard and say, where have you moved this prisoner? The natural conclusion for the women and the disciples is that Jesus had not raised from the dead, but that he'd been taken maybe to a graveyard for criminals, maybe taken so that people wouldn't flock to his grave. That's why we know in one of the historical accounts that Mary, when she first arrived at the empty tomb, says, where have you taken him? Not, oh wow, he must have risen from the dead. That only happened after she had seen him. That was the only thing that led her to the conclusion that he had raised. Putting this all together, the German scholar Gerd Ludemann, another man who doesn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus, says this, that it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. They might have been hallucinations, they might have been imagining it all, but that's what they thought had happened. And so we have these three bits of evidence. We have the early Christian claim of a risen Jesus, we have an empty tomb, and we have these experiences of a risen Jesus. What is the best explanation for that evidence? Let's look at a couple of theories that have been put forward. One is the so-called conspiracy theory. It says that Jesus died and was buried, but then his disciples stole the body. I think there's a couple of problems with this. Firstly, we know that the majority of Jesus' disciples were executed for saying that he was the Lord. And this conspiracy theory doesn't help us understand why they would be prepared to go to their deaths for something they knew wasn't true. It also doesn't explain the point we touched on earlier, that if you were trying to write a conspiracy to convince people of something that wasn't true, you wouldn't make the first witnesses to the resurrection women in the context where a woman's word was seen as untrustworthy. And finally, it doesn't explain why people even started thinking Jesus might have risen, because no one was expecting that to happen. In the first century, if your favorite Messiah was executed by Rome, you either fled or you found a new Messiah. And there were actually plenty of other so-called messiahs who claimed some level of divinity but who were killed, and in no other cases I'm aware of did their followers start saying, oh, they've risen from the dead, because it's not the natural conclusion to reach. And you've got no motivation to do it either. It's likely that you would only face the same kind of scrutiny and trouble that ended up in your Messiah being killed in the first place. But this theory claims that within a few hours of Jesus' death, the grief-stricken disciples brought together a conspiracy so clever and so unexpected that it's held firm and transformed the world. The second explanation is that maybe Jesus wasn't really dead. Maybe he was just unconscious and he came back to life, or came awake again in the tomb. But I think there's problems here too. Firstly, it doesn't explain how a man executed by Rome could survive. Rome was pretty good at killing people. And also the sources tell us that blood and water came out of Jesus' side. And they didn't know that at the time, but we now know that was a condition called respiratory acidosis that indicates death. So the medical authorities tell us that Jesus was dead. But maybe the biggest problem of this is that it doesn't just mean that Jesus survived the crucifixion. He then has to move away a 2-ton stone, escape from the guards, and travel around the whole of Jerusalem and the wider regions, convincing people, body battered and bruised, that he was actually the risen and all-conquering Savior of the world. I think it's a hard claim to make. We'll look at one more. The third theory that's often put forward is hallucination, that maybe the disciples just imagined these visions of Jesus. And it doesn't explain the empty tomb, but maybe it can explain the visions. But I want to ask you a question. Imagine that you have a friend who has just died, and you're sitting in your front room, and you have a vision of them. You think that they're talking to you. And a few minutes later, that's not happening anymore. But what do you think? Do you think, I've just remembered my friend? Or do you think, they've come back to life? typically, visions of dead people are not evidence that they've been raised from the dead, but evidence that they are, in fact, still dead. It's not only that. Even if someone had had one of these hallucinations and reached the unlikely conclusion that that therefore meant that Jesus was raised, you would then need all of the other people who had the same hallucination to reach that same conclusion, including those who didn't follow Jesus before he died. This is why I don't think the hallucination theory stands up to much scrutiny. And actually, the scholar Geza Vermes, who we've looked at already today, he documents the journey that he went on, looking at all these different theories about how the evidence can show what it shows. But he said that all in all, none of the suggested theories stands up to stringent scrutiny. He then rejects the Christian story as well. But he does it because he says, we know that people can't come back from the dead. And so he says, we must instead just fall back on speculation. We must admit that we're never going to know what happened. The New Testament scholar N.T. Wright looks at the same evidence. He reaches the same conclusions about the implausibility of the alternative theories. But then he says this about the one that we are yet to look at today. The proposal that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead possesses unrivaled power to explain the historical data at the heart of Christianity. He says the claim that maybe Jesus really was who he says he was and that he rose from the dead is by far the best explanation for the evidence we have, but also we have to acknowledge that it has one weakness, and the weakness is that it assumes a God might exist. Because if a God does exist, then presumably the fact that he could, if he wanted, raise someone from the dead is relatively uncontroversial. The only thing is, could it be that God does? And I understand the problem with this explanation. The charge, of course, is that it's just a little bit too neat, a little bit too easy, maybe even a little bit lazy. You don't really know what happens, and so you therefore say, well, God must have done it. And I think I would be inclined to agree if this was, I don't know, my mate John, and John died, and then a couple of days later he came back to life and he walked into the room and said, oh, God did it. I might have some questions, but I don't think I'd be particularly persuaded by his answer. But this is not that situation. In Jesus, we have a man who came to the earth who said that he had been sent by God. He said, I've come here to reveal God to you. He said, tear down this temple, and in 3 days I will build it again. And the authorities heard this claim, and they said, how dare you say that? How dare you say that you are equal with God? How dare you make that claim about yourself? And for that reason, they killed him. When that man, 3 days later, walks out of the grave, what conclusion do we reach? For me, when my doubt is at its highest peak, when things in life are tough, when I see evidence to the contrary, when I find things in the Bible that I struggle to understand, when I see evil and suffering in the world, time after time I come back to this evidence that I've summarized this morning, and I can only conclude by looking at his life, his death, and ultimately his resurrection, that Jesus Christ really is who he said he was, the Son of God, risen from the dead. We said we look at three things in this passage. John the Baptist had some doubts. We said, number one, that Jesus wasn't cross, that he raised them. We said, number two, and we looked at this at some length, look at the evidence. Number three, Jesus pointed to a great future ahead. And this great future doesn't seem like it's going to happen in the moment, because what we know from other passages is that a drunken and boastful king, Herod, eventually ends John's life in that very prison. His head is placed on a platter at the request of his daughter-in-law. But before that happens, Jesus told us two things in this passage. First, that among those born of women, none was greater than John. He had achieved what he came to do, and that's why we will be celebrating him today, and people are still called John, and churches are named after him, whilst Herod is the figure of much ridicule. But secondly, Jesus says that all those who place their trust in him, even the least in the kingdom of heaven, are even greater still. How can this be true? How can it be that all those who follow Jesus are in a better position than the greatest man who ever lived? Well, we heard this quote earlier from Richard Dawkins, didn't we? It says, presumably what happened to Jesus was what happens to all of us when we die. And I've tried to explain why I don't agree with the second half of that statement. But on that first sentence, I wholeheartedly agree. The claim at the center of Christianity is that what happened to Jesus when he died is exactly what will happen to everyone who places their trust in him. We too will be raised. We too will be given an eternal body. We too will be with him forever. Paul, the early Christian leader, says this: we eagerly await a Savior from there, the Lord Jesus Christ, who, by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control, will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body. What has happened to Jesus on Resurrection Day 2,000 years ago will one day happen to all who believe. And it is a wonderful future. It's an incredible hope, because it means that whatever else we face and whatever doubts we have and whatever teachings we wrestle with and whatever suffering we go through, at the heart of the Christian faith is not just a philosophy, it's not just an experience, it's not just a clever argument, but it's an event, an historical event that points ahead to this great future for all. A future where we'll be with Jesus in a remade and eternal world, where the pain of this world will somehow both be forgotten and redeemed at the same time. And I want to end this morning by handing over to Tina to tell us that story again. Because the power of the Christian response to doubt comes not just with rational argument, but it comes in Jesus' death and his resurrection. As we listen to that story, we are transformed. So this is the retelling of the last week of Jesus' life. It's written by a Guardian journalist named Francis Spufford. It's titled Yeshua, which is the Aramaic name for Jesus. So let's listen now to those last few days of Jesus' life.
Yeshua is never disgusted. He never says that anything, anyone, is too dirty to be touched, that anyone is too lost to be found. Even in situations where there seem to be no grounds for human hope, he will not agree that hope is gone beyond recall. He says, more can be mended than you fear. Far more can be mended than you know. He turns toward the one city. It's where this story was always going. It's where a Christ would have to declare himself. It's where power is. It is the place where actions stop being provisional, experimental, retrievable, and become definite, final. It's where this drama, whatever it is, must find its ending. They arrive at the walls, but it's too late in the evening for the entrance Yeshua has in mind, so they wait till the next day in the straggly settlement outside the gates. Then in they go. Yeshua and the nucleus of 20 or so men and women who have been following him about. The narrow stone streets are packed with visitors who've come in from the province for the biggest festival of the year, and the visitors see, well, something like a parade, with Yeshua riding in a borrowed donkey, and the friends around him shouting, "Make way! Make way!" The scene is hard to read. It's like a royal progress and a parody of a royal progress all at once. Yeshua is doing exactly what a Christ would do if he were making a momentum play, gambling on snowballing crowd support, yet the details are off script somehow, from the donkey to the way that only some of the friends seem to be shouting the slogans you'd expect. It isn't clear what's happening. The evening sees Yeshua and the friends celebrating the festival in a borrowed upstairs room. His mood is strange, and they keep looking at him perturbed as they eat the roast lamb and yeastless bread with bitter herbs, and they share the cup of wine and tell the story of how the one God long ago brought his people out of captivity. After supper, he does something that isn't in the festival ritual. He picks up one of the flat loaves they haven't touched yet. "This is my body," he says, and he snaps it in half using both hands. He asks for the wine cup. "This is my blood," he says. "Do this when you remember me." Remember you? Remember you? Where are you going? We won't leave you. Don't worry about today, it doesn't matter. We won't leave you, teacher. But they do. A few hours later, in the dark, on the open ground at the edge of the city where they're camped out, a patrol of temple guards find them and the friends, looking to Yeshua for guidance and getting none, hesitate, waver, and run for it, leaving him alone in custody. Daylight finds him in a procession again, but this time no one could mistake him for a king. He's stumbling along under the weight of his own instrument of execution, a great big wooden thing he can hardly lift, with an escort of the Empire's soldiers, and the bystanders who've come blinking out of the lodgings where they spent the festival night don't see their hopes, or even the possibility of their hopes, parading by. They see their disappointment. They see their frustration. They see everything in themselves that is too weak or too afraid to confront the strapping paratroopers, and much though they hate the soldiers, they hate him more for his pathetic slide into victimhood. Word of his loose living, his impiety, his pleasure in bad company goes round in whispers, and just look at him. There's something disgusting about him, don't you think? Something that makes you squirm inside. Something furtive. He's so pale and sickly looking with that dried blood round his mouth. He looks like a feeble criminal being led away by the police. He looks like something from under a rock, as if he doesn't deserve the daylight. He's a blot on the new day. Someone kicks him as he goes by and whoops. Down he goes, flat on his nose, with the cross pinning him like a struggling insect. And let's face it, it's funny. Yeshua is a joke. He's less a Messiah, more of a patch of something nasty on the pavement. As he struggles on, he recognises every roaring, jeering face. He knows our names. He knows our histories. The soldiers lead him out of the city gate, and laboriously, slipping and sliding, with crunching blows from spear butts to motivate him, they drive him up the small cone of Skull Hill, where death sentences are carried out. They tie him onto the cross and plant it upright. It's the Empire's punishment for rebellious slaves, slow and nasty by design, devised to be a spectacle of days-long struggle and gasping to passers-by. On a cross, you choke to death, when you're finally too tired to heave your own weight up to take the next breath. He cannot do anything deliberate now. The strain of his whole weight on his outstretched arms hurts too much. The pain fills him up, displaces thought as much for him as it has for everyone else who has ever been stuck to one of these horrible contrivances, and yet he goes on taking it in. It's not what he does. It is what he is. He is all open door to sorrow, suffering, guilt, despair, horror, everything that cannot be escaped, and he does not even try to escape it. He turns to meet it and claims it all as his own. This is mine now, he is saying, and he embraces it with all that is left in him, each dark act, each dripping memory, as if it was something precious, as if it were itself the loved child tottering homeward on the road. But there is so much of it. So many injured children, so many locked rooms, so much lonely anger, so many bombs in public places, so much vicious zeal. So many bored teenagers at roadblocks, so many drunk girls at parties someone thought they could have a little fun with, So many jokes that go too far, so much ruining greed, so much sick ingenuity, so much burned skin. The world he claims him. It burns and stings, it splinters and gouges, it locks him round and drags him down. Of course it does. Love can't repair death. Death is stronger than love. We all know that. But Yeshua didn't, until now. This is the first time in his entire life he's ever felt alone. Now there is no love song. There is no kind father. There is just a man on a cross dying in pain, a foolish man who chose to give up life and breath to be a carcass on a pole. The yellow walls of the city blur with Yeshua's tears, and he opens his mouth and howls the news, new only to him, that we are abandoned in a dark place where help never comes. The friends creep out at dusk and ask for the body, promising anonymous burial and no fuss. They're allowed to carry it away, wrapped in a tube of linen that slowly stains from inside. Skull Hill sees lots of such cortèges. There's only time to stick what's left of Yeshua hastily in a rock tomb by the highway. Washing the corpse properly and laying it out will have to wait. The Holy Saturday is coming, and no one wants any confrontations. All day long, the next day, the city is quiet. The air above the city lacks the usual 1,000 little trails of smoke from cook fires. Hymns rise from the temple. Families are indoors. The soldiers are back in barracks. The chief priest grows hoarse with singing. The governor plays chess with his secretary and dictates letters. The free bread the temple distributed to the poor has gone stale by midday, but tastes all right dipped in water or broth. Death has interrupted life, only as much as it ever does. We die one at a time and disappear, but the life of the living continues. The earth turns. The sun makes its way towards the western horizon, no slower or faster than it usually does. Each Sunday morning, one of the friends comes back with rags and a jug of water and a box of the grave spices that are supposed to cut down on the smell. She's braced for the task, but when she comes to the grave, she finds that the linen's been thrown into the corner and the body is gone. Evidently, anonymous burial isn't quite anonymous enough after all. She sits outside in the sun. The insects have woken up, here at the edge of the desert, and a bee is nosing about in a lily-like silky, thinly tucked over itself, but much more perishable. It won't last long. She takes no notice of the feet that appear at the edge of her vision. That's enough now, she thinks. That's more than enough. Don't be afraid, says Yeshua. Far more can be mended than you know.
Jesus says far more can be mended than we know. And if we have doubts about Jesus, if we're unsure about his character, unsure whether it's worth it, unsure whether he can be trusted, if we feel a long way from him this morning, I want to encourage you to let his life, his death, and his resurrection confront you again. Because at the cross, Jesus didn't just prove himself to you, although he did that in his resurrection, but he accomplished something for you. His defeat of death means that you have an incredible future to look forward to, and this victory over evil means that you can enjoy life today as well. United with Christ, we can live the lives that we were made to live because Jesus won it for us. As John the Baptist will tell you, it might not always be easy, but that's what Jesus accomplished for those who place their trust in him. And I want to encourage you to come before him again, to commit yourself to him again, to thank him again, and to live the life that he has made you to live. If you've never considered the evidence for Christianity before, I want to encourage you to do that, to reflect on some of the things that we've spoken about. C.S. Lewis said that if Christianity, if it's false, if it's of it's of no importance. The story that we just heard might be sad, but it's futile. But he says, if it is true, then Christianity is of infinite importance, and the only thing it cannot be is moderately important. The conclusion we reach about Jesus Christ of Nazareth, who he is and what he did, is the most important decision that we will ever make. And if you've not yet considered the evidence, Chris is going to explain in a little while how we can help you to do that if you would like. But before he does, I want to finish with a song to reflect on the story that we've just heard again, to celebrate Jesus, to celebrate who he is. So let's sing together.